Before we get there, I wanted to talk a little bit about trauma today and something that I like to talk about in relation to that, and that is cymatics. So that's so with a C, cymatics is the study of sound affecting usually water or some kind of material like sand. And it shows the relationship between sound waves and the effect on changing the structure of a solid thing. It's a very, very powerful way for us to understand how sound waves work. Now, there are two people right now that are dealing with how sound and energy and focus and consciousness affect water. One of them is, I believe his name is Masaru Emoto, who did the original studies into the consciousness of water, that water is a sentient consciousness. It is structured, it is impacted by what it experiences, and it's reciprocal in how it interacts with us. In other words, you can literally bless and restructure a glass of water. Equally true, you can curse and destructure in a dissonant way a glass of water. It's been demonstrated. Now, Veda Austin has taken this a little step further. Check out her work. I can put a bunch of links underneath this replay. But the point is, the human body is predominantly made up of water. So things affect us. They restructure us constantly, which is why a daily coherence regime is going to help you to manage that, all of these impacts. But let's go back to trauma. So when a trauma happens, and you can define trauma in any which way you want, but trauma is a severe intrusion on your actual electromagnetic field. Most often, trauma actually penetrates the body in some form or another. And what happens is, through trauma, is we can, and you can think about it even through a bad narcissistic relationship, for example, you get imprinted. That overlays over your own beautiful resonance field, that overlays a pattern. Now that pattern is, if it is not properly released and integrated, will fractalize. And this is what the nine shared with me this morning. They showed me a process which is a default fractalization. What that means is, if we don't integrate what happened to us, if we don't spend time healing and releasing from the trauma, that it becomes crystallized, it becomes solid, and it stays lodged, and in fact imprints us until we're ready to face that trauma again. Because the trauma itself was something that was called to us to go through. So what the nine have shared is that there is a lot of bypassing that happens with trauma. What they say is that the body sentient must transcend trauma. And that doesn't mean that trauma is erased. That doesn't mean you didn't go through something very painful that left its scars and bruises on your soul. Doesn't mean that. It doesn't excuse poor behavior in others at all. There is no permission granted for the willful, violent act on another human being or a living thing. You just need to hear that. That's not what we're talking about here. What is being spoken of is that when you live in a free will reality zone, such as 3D Earth, you sign up knowing that there could be random things that happen to you, around you. You know that. And that is not your fault, but trauma still happens. So the trauma itself is there for you to work through. It's not the best thing to happen, but it should not crystallize and define the rest of your life. So what the nine have shared with me is, there is so much wisdom on our planet right now, with therapists, with somatic release. There are shamanic practices. There is acupuncture, which realigns your meridian line, which is really powerful after a traumatic incident. There is deep tissue massage. There are salt baths. There are many, many, many ways that we can release trauma from our body system itself, because it isn't just the physical body, it isn't just what it does to the mind, and it isn't just how it imprints on your electromagnetic field. It is system-wide, and is not to be taken lightly. And what the Nine have shared with me recently is that this is the time, the beginning of the cosmic age, is where we collectively and individually heal from our traumas, and we all carry them. Now, if you don't think you have a trauma, you might want to ponder how many people in your lineage had a trauma, experienced a trauma. We only have to go back 100 years to world wars to know that humans have experienced trauma on a collective level. So this information is really powerful. It's time to, if you will, they're saying to stop and lick your wounds. It's time to see how beautiful you are, but also how much we have been wounded, and how it's possible to alchemize the trauma itself and to release it, so it doesn't continue to imprint you and affect your decisions. So this idea of fractalization is really important. And I'm going to give you an example before we drop into the technique. Let's say you've had a really awful experience with somebody, and you seem to attract that type of person into your life, and you don't deal with it. You don't deal with why this kind of person is being drawn into your life. Essentially, what you've done is you've fractalized an aspect of that personality type. You fractalized it, and because it's fractalized by default, because you've tried to avoid it, you end up, through the law of attraction, you end up bringing it back into your field. So everything in life that comes at us and through us is an invitation to go deeper and to heal, not just for ourselves, but for the human race. Now, in the fall, in a program that I'll be running, a course, I will be addressing this in much more detail. But for now, it's important for us to remember that we are not defined by our traumas. We can transcend them, we can integrate them, and we can move forward in life with a beautiful, clear electromagnetic field. And that's really empowering, because once we can do that, we give permission for all of those around us to do the same. So we affect people. We don't have to announce it. Simply by doing the work ourselves, by staying in coherence, we automatically give others permission to look at the trauma. One of the things that the Nine have showed me is the benefit of having and working in small groups. There is an intimacy and a 360 analysis that can happen in a safe, secure growth environment. In other words, and I recently went through this myself, I went through a trauma recently. I could not fully understand what was happening to me. I could only understand it from my reaction to it, and from my own biases, and from my own previous traumas that were ignited. But through the help of a small group, I was able to see the situation 360, and I was able to cognitively, somatically, body-wide release, experience and feel, but then release the trauma. And why the Nine brought this up for me is they wanted me to remember that if I don't complete the release, that I run the risk of imprinting it and running it again. So this is a really important component of your technology. It has the ability to reset and reboot. But before that, we don't bypass. We fully feel. We fully heal. We are organic and we are embodied. And there's a sublime beauty to that, and simplicity. So in the second part, I'd like to talk about collective trauma, right? So this is beyond, obviously, the individual level. This could be in a family, a collective. It could be in a culture collective. It could be an entire country collective. And as we can see, the greater macro projection of that would be the collective on the planet right now. So trauma is an equal opportunities experience. It doesn't matter whether it's an individual or whether it's a group or whether it's an entire continent. Trauma fractalizes and patterns out in exactly the same way. So again, whether it's the individual or whether it's an entire continent or indeed a planet, when trauma happens, it's like, imagine a frozen lake, a beautiful, smooth frozen lake, and then imagine impact on that frozen layer and just a huge web of I want to get this right. Imagine fracture as a pattern all over that lake, and it gets so fractured that frozen surface no longer supports, and then whatever is causing the fracturing pushes down onto the body of water, and then all the fractures become shards that just impact what's underneath, which prior to that was not moved. It was just a body of water. So in terms of consciousness, in terms of the collective psyche, if a trauma isn't acknowledged as a trauma, if there's no responsibility taken, if there's no healing, if there's no communication, and especially if the trauma is so great that it is bypassed because it's so shocking, this creates a default pattern. So it's the fracture. And that wound, those wounds stay crystallized in the collective, just as they would in an individual. Now we can imagine what trauma would do in a family where it's taboo to talk about the perpetrator or the trauma itself, where there's denial, or there's gaslighting, blaming the victim. We can imagine the damage done in that family to all of the individuals, whether they are actually touched by the trauma or not. The trauma will be felt as a fractal, as a default fractal, and it will continue to create a vibrational pattern that will drive all of the impulses, all of the reactions to the original trauma. It will keep driving them. Now, it may not drive them necessarily to the surface in healthy ways. In fact, very, very often, because perhaps there is denial, perhaps because no one's taken responsibility, because there's been no healing, no reconciliation, no release, no forgiveness, no compensation in some cases, no reparations made. It's going to come up in unconscious ways, and quite often, in fact 99.9% out of 100, it's going to come out in one or two ways. The first way it will be that the person will hurt themselves. The person, the family, the group will have some kind of behavior that is self-harming, that is continuing to inflict traumatic wounds onto themselves. The second way is that, and it could be both, that group or that family perpetrate a form of the trauma on other people. So it just grows out. So trauma is a big deal. It's being talked about more and more, and it should be, because most of our problems, if you ran the list, if you put the list up and you just ran through the list of all the problems that we're facing on this planet right now, you would probably find most of them underscored with trauma. They're all examples of trauma responses, whether that person or that corporation or whether that conglomerate or whether that family knew they were acting out of trauma. They are actually acting traumatically. And it's a fractal. So it's literally that you become what hurt you. And like I said, it's not that everybody who's been traumatized becomes someone who perpetrates trauma. I'm not saying that. I'm saying you take it in and you exhibit it somehow, whether it be self-harm, whether it be the way you live your life as a traumatized person or a traumatized family. But there will be ways it is acted out as well, outside of you, outside of the group. So a really good example of this is if you've had a group of people that have been traumatized over and over and over again, and then they get to a place of some power, some freedom, and if that trauma that they've experienced over the centuries isn't healed, it may come up in the form of them repeating the behavior of the people that perpetrated against them. This is just what happens. And most of the time there's no connection made. It's just written off as poor behavior, but it really is just a repatterning. It's a fractalization of the trauma that they suffered as a group, as a people, as a nationality, that they are then patterning out exactly, more or less exactly the same as what they suffered. Now, there's another way that you can see trauma that's been released by, say, a country, a nation state, onto other peoples and continents and groups and countries, is that the trauma that they created in their conquesting, in their invasion of, in their taking of that which didn't belong to them under the guise of empire, that returns back home. And so that trauma is reimagined within the country of origin, and it creates destruction from the inside out. Now, some people would argue that's karma. I think it's cause and effect. I do think it's an example of what trauma does. Trauma is it's been likened to rust, that slow corrosion over time, just eating away if it's not dealt with. It's been likened to mold, where it can be hidden, but it's right beneath the surface and it's ready and it's having an effect. You just don't realize what the effect is. You're breathing in, for example, mold spores and you don't know. And it's been likened to cancer, a rapidly growing cancer, that it can overtake very quickly. Trauma can overwhelm and overtake. So from the point of view of the nine, and from the perspective of an omnist, we are very mindful that if we are to create a world that is functional and exceptional, and at least starts to meet the requirements that have been set for a grade 1 civilization, which is what we're aiming for with the cosmic age, then we have to hit certain milestones. And one of those milestones is an end of trauma. So we're going to have to work towards a world, a society, a global society where trauma, it just doesn't occur. So we're going to have to look at what causes trauma. And like I said, there's many, many different ways that you can traumatize someone or some group or some culture or some entire country, and in fact an entire planet. So we've got to look at what causes trauma, and we've got to look within ourselves at perhaps the trauma that has been sustained by us, by our loved ones, by our lineage. Most of us, if we go back 100 years, we would discover that our ancestors lived through extremely traumatic times. Well, that trauma doesn't go away. It's an energetic patterning. It has an effect. But the good news is, bringing awareness is like bringing daylight and bleach to mold it, and fresh air. It can remove it immediately. It can remove the damage immediately. But we need to take action. So not just individually, not just as groups, not just as families, but as societies. Trauma isn't something we should be tolerant of. And not all traumas are physical. Not all traumas are in the general list that gets given, as bad as they are. There's a lot of trauma caused by prejudice, by racism, by misogyny, classism, discrimination. There's so many ways, verbal abuse. There's so many ways you can cause trauma. And it's time to stop. It's time to just really, all of us, stop hurting each other, hurting ourselves, and perpetuating the fractalization of trauma. And I think it's possible within 100 years, if we really put our full attention to this subject, which is at the very heart of so much dysfunction. If we really tackled it, I think it could be completely eradicated within 100 years. I really believe that. So if trauma is something that's happened to you, I would urge you to go seek help. Find the help that you need. And what we're doing here is no substitution for therapy or psychotherapy or pharmaceutical help. If you need certain things, go and get professional help. If you're aware of trauma and you can support somebody, support them. Let them tell you, let them talk to you, let them share. And gently, encourage them to step into healing. Because while trauma is significant, it needn't define us. It needn't imprint us to the point where it becomes who we are. We're powerful, and we have the ability to heal. So be kind to yourself. Give yourself time. And allow what needs to come up. Because, as I've said before, sometimes what we're feeling isn't even our own trauma. It's the trauma that's generational. And we can ask for that to be realized, to be brought to our attention through consciousness, which acts like the sunlight to mold. Just bring consciousness to it, bring awareness to it. Feel what you need to feel. Allow those feelings to flow. We don't hold on to them. We allow them to flow in and we allow them to flow out. And we just stay really, really grounded.